Too high and you'll be cardiovascularly exhausted, too low and your muscles will be extremely fatigued. We are talking about cadence and its effect on your running.
So what is the best cadence for cycling when it comes to triathlon?
We talk about the perfect cadence when it comes to cycling, and we even talk about the perfect cadence in running. But what happens in a triathlon when the run follows the bike? What are the numbers that you should be aiming for then?
Well, let's start with a bit of honesty. If you're hoping we're going to give you a specific number that you should aim for, I'm afraid we can't do that. In fact, if you watch the Pro Peloton in the Tour de France or the time trial in the UCI World Champs, or the 10,000 meter at the Olympics or the Marathon World Champs, the one thing you'll notice all the pros doing is variation. There's going to be a big variation in cadence. While you'll generally notice that the pros are probably higher than your average runner or cyclist, there is still a very big variation. Everyone is going to find their own perfect cadence.
Yeah, and the same comes to triathlon, and also the difference you'll notice if you watch the pros between some of their cycling cadence and their running cadence. All right, just before we go into too much detail, I want to make sure we're all on the same page when we're talking about cadence, and obviously in particular cycling cadence today. Well, it's the amount of revolutions, so the amount of pedal strokes you make with 1 foot or 1 pedal per minute, RPM, revolutions per minute. And you'll find that naturally you just settle into what's comfortable for you. And if, say, you don't have a bike computer or you've not ridden a spin bike or something, you might not even know what your cadence is. It might be something you've never thought about. But on the whole, a sort of normal average is somewhere between 60 RPM and 90 RPM, with those who are newer to the sport being, on the whole, at the lower end of that spectrum.
Yeah, pros though will often be higher. It's not unusual to see pros up around 100. For example, Lance Armstrong was famed for having a high cadence all the time, and even Chris Froome had a very high cadence. He would ride as much as 100 RPM, even going up hills. But having a high cadence is definitely not a prerequisite to going fast. You can still go fast, even with a lower cadence.
Speed is determined mostly by the amount of power you're putting out, and this is calculated by the force that you put down through your pedal on each pedal stroke, known as torque, multiplied by the amount of times you move your pedals in a minute, so your cadence. And the relevance of this being, if you had, say, a high cadence but a low torque, that could actually be the same amount of power as a low cadence and a high torque.
But if we've now determined that you can have the same power output regardless of your cadence, why does it even matter what speed you turn the pedals?
Yeah, well, let's look at a low cadence. So at a low cadence, you're going to be really working those muscles, recruiting more of the powerful, some of those fast twitch muscles, but you're not going to be putting very much stress on the cardiovascular system. You're not going to be demanding a huge amount of oxygen, but you will be fatiguing those muscles.
Conversely, if you have a higher cadence, your muscles will not be working as hard with each contraction, not pushing as much power. But you will be stressing your cardiovascular system much more. Your heart rate will go up, your breathing rate will go up because of that higher cadence. Now, what you do with this information on high versus low cadence is up to you, how you want to use it on race day. High cadence and low cadence both have their pros and cons. For example, if you're riding at a high cadence with that higher heart rate and higher breathing, it's going to be that much more difficult to fuel while you're going. So in a long triathlon, that may not be the best option. Conversely, having a low cadence is going to really fatigue those muscles of your legs, and then you've got to run afterwards. So that might not benefit you in your triathlon. You've really got to weigh them up and decide what works best for you. The terrain of your triathlon will also make a big difference. It's one thing to have an ideal cadence on the flats, but when you start going uphill, your ideal cadence might change quite drastically.
Having listened to that, you might suddenly decide, well, I want to ride at what I now think is an ideal cadence in my next triathlon, but it's not as simple as just clicking your fingers and then being able to ride at that RPM. If you do feel you need to make a change that's going to help your running off the bike, you're going to need to spend plenty of time riding in that cadence in training.
Now, you might have heard pros or coaches talking about overgear work or big gear work. Essentially, that's exactly what the name's suggests they ride in doing sessions or at least reps at a much lower cadence than they would normally do. They would really exaggerate this. It wouldn't be a cadence they'd ever hold in a race. But this is to work your cycling strength. That's the primary reason for it, is to work those leg muscles and get them really working hard, build your cycling strength. But one of the bonuses of it is that it does also improve your ability to ride at lower cadences, should you choose to. Conversely, you may also have seen them do some higher cadence stuff. And this is not really to stress the cardiovascular system and get your heart rate up, which you would do with intervals or similar. It's more to improve the neuromuscular recruitment at those higher cadences. This is going to improve your overall pedaling efficiency.
Now, irrelevant of what RPM or cadence you are actually aiming for, including a variation in your training is going to be a great way for those training benefits, but also to help you find what is going to be your optimal and your natural. And once you have sort of dialed in what you think you want to ride at, you're going to need to make sure that you spend the majority of your training time at that cadence, so that when it does come to the triathlon, you're going to be most natural in that. And on that point, talking of races and looking ahead, if you've got a cadence you're happy with and you know the power you want to put out, you might want to just check the elevation of the course and make sure that you've got the right gear ratios that are going to enable you to ride as close to what is comfortable for you.
Now, we've not talked too much about your actual run in the triathlon, and that's because your cycling cadence, or the cadence you choose in your cycling, through all the things we've already explained, is going to make such a big difference to your run. But if you do find that your running cadence is significantly different to your cycling cadence, for example, you have quite a high running cadence but quite a low cycling cadence, then it's well worth, towards the end of the cycle leg of the triathlon, starting to match up those cycling cadence with what your running cadence is going to be. It's just going to make that transition from the bike to the run that much smoother.
Yeah, but finally, the biggest effect on how you feel on your run after the bike is actually going to be how you pace that bike ride and how conditioned you are to cycling and how well practiced you are at those bike to run transitions. So yeah, it comes back to those brick sessions. Make sure you include plenty of those, because they will have more of an effect than your cadence will on that overall performance.
Yeah, if you've experimented with your cadence and found it made a big difference to your run, or experimented with your cadence and found it made no difference to your run, we'd love to hear from you. So leave your comments in the section down below. And remember to like this video if you've enjoyed it, and subscribe to the channel for more triathlon related content.